Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap there. So with intermittent fasting, I mean, basically the term is just you're taking periods of time without eating. That's basically what that actually means. And ultimately, I mean, you could be fasting from a lot of things. You could be fast from social media, you could fast from, sugar, right? Things like that. So there's a lot of things you could fast from. For the purpose of our conversation, we're talking about food in general. And then time restricted feeding is kind of this idea of compressing our feeding window. So again, there's a lot of crossover there. I kind of use those interchangeably. Time restricted feeding is going to be more so in a 24-hour period, whereas intermittent fasting can be ultimately, I consider anything over 48 hours of fasting to be a prolonged fast. And the reason for that is after about 48 hours of fasting, you stop producing digestive juices, stomach acid, bile, pancreatic enzymes. So there's a whole, additional set of mechanisms that take place. Whereas, if you break your fast at 36 hours, your body was still even though it had reduced its production of these digestive juices, they're still present. They're still you're still producing smaller amounts of those, and so therefore, it's still kind of in this window of like a more of a short fast or intermittent fast, as opposed to an extended fast. Again, anything over 48 hours, I consider an extended fast. And then time restricted feeding is really like in a 24-hour period where are you compartmentalizing or compressing your eating window? So you might eat in a 6-hour eating window from, let's say, 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. That's your eating window. And then you are, based on that, you have an 18-hour window where you're not eating, you're fasting, from 6 p.m. to 12 p.m. the next day. So that's
So
kind of how I use those terms.
would you classify that the example that you just gave as intermittent fasting or as time restricted feeding?
Really both. I don't have a problem with somebody saying, okay, I'm intermittent fasting and I'm doing an 18-6 or a 16-8, or if they say I do time restricted feeding, 18-6, 16-8. I don't have a problem with using either one of those terms. I think they're both accurate terms.
Okay, so where do you think the like a good threshold could be to distinguish those two? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it would it be like, let's say, a 6 hour or a 4 hour feeding window? You could classify as, okay, that's intermittent fasting, whereas a 10 hour feeding window is just normal daily life, not technically intermittent fasting. You're just eating with an 8 or a 10 hour feeding window each day.
Well, I think it depends on like what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. So if you're eating in a 10-hour eating window, I still call it, like in my book, I talk about different types of fasts. We talk about a simple fast, which is like a 12-hour overnight fast, which, is really more mindfulness. I mean, it's really an easy process to, eat in a 12-hour eating window and fast 12 hours overnight. It's actually very easy, but for some people, they're mindlessly eating, so at night they're, snacking on something before they go to bed, or maybe they've been trained this way, like in order to put on muscle. I know for me, many years ago, I was a personal trainer and I thought I had to have a big protein shake before I went to bed and then wake up in the morning, eat first thing in the morning. So we start out with kind of a mindfulness practice, which we call a simple fast. Could you call that just, time restricted feeding? You call it what you want. You know what I mean? 14 hours, I call it the brunch fast. It's kind of like you're pushing out your breakfast a little bit, like your morning meal a little bit further, and you're focusing on hydration in the morning. And then you get into kind of like that 16-8, which is a really popular approach. And by that point, your body starts really dipping into fat stores. You start to break down body fat. And of course, it depends. It's always individualized, because if you have high insulin, if you're very insulin resistant, you're going to struggle to burn fat until you get your insulin levels down and more sensitive. However, if you're following that 16-8 over time and your body's adapting to that, you're going to start burning fat for fuel. And then once you get into like the 18-hour, you're starting to ramp up some autophagy. And then if you can push it, and one of my goals, what I really think would be a great goal for, the vast majority of our society, is for everybody, unless you're like a pregnant woman, nursing a newborn like my wife is, or a high level athlete in season, or possibly like a type 1 diabetic or a young child, doing something like a 20 to 24-hour fast one day every single week, I think is one of the best things you can do to improve your metabolic flexibility, to where your body's good at burning fat and sugar for fuel, good at producing ketones, running off ketones, and also ramping up intracellular healing, this process of autophagy, which we can go on to further. Now, what you want to call those things, I think, I don't know the actual definitions, of time restricted feeding, intermittent fasting. I think that these things are very interchangeable as far as, the terminology we use. But yeah, that's my thought on it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think um, there's different. I think part of the fuzziness is that people use the terms in different ways. I personally think something like maybe the cutoff being below, 6 hours, maybe 4 hours a day might be a reasonable thing. Or to say you do a prolonged fast of, let's say, a 20 or 24-hour fast or 36-hour fast once or twice a week. I think that would clearly be, intermittent fasting rather than time restricted feeding. Like, so to me, I think somewhere in there makes sense to cut it off, but ultimately it's just semantics. And
Yeah, I think time restricted feeding definitely is within a 24-hour window. What are you looking at? Where are you eating your meals in that 24-hour window? You know what I mean? Whereas intermittent fasting can extend beyond that.
exactly. Yeah. Okay. So how did you get started? What was
Yeah.
your, catalyst for becoming interested in fasting and experimenting with it?
Well, like I mentioned, I was a personal trainer in my early 20s, and I was eating 6 meals a day. I took a nutrition class, and I had to count up all my calories, and it was like 5,500 calories a day because I thought that's what I needed to do. I'm an ectomorph body type, so I have thin shoulders. I'm a thinner body type, and of course, when you're a personal trainer, you want to look jacked, right? You want to look big and strong like you, Ari, right? And so anyways, I was trying to do that, and I was lifting heavy, and trying to put on all this muscle mass. And I always had digestive issues, but it really caught up to me in my early 20s. I developed irritable bowel, and I actually got to the point where I lost 30 pounds of body weight, muscle,
Wow.
right? Even though I was trying to exercise, trying to eat, I would have intense cramping, bloating in my gut. And, I had developed orthostatic hypotension. I go from sitting to standing. I feel super dizzy. And this is around the time I started graduate school in chiropractic college. And I picked up a book called The Maker's Diet by a guy who's now a friend of mine, Jordan Rubin. And he was talking all about, diet changes, right? Grass-fed, organic animal products, sprouted grains, this kind of stuff. Another friend of mine turned me on to Dr. Mercola. I started reading his stuff. This is back in 2005.
It's funny.
And
I could literally transplant my own story in there. Apart from the irritable bowel syndrome, that's like
yeah,
identical to how I went from 6 meals a day to experimenting with fasting as well.
yeah, exactly. So anyways, I started making diet changes, and I was actually a vegetarian in 2004. So for a few years, I was a vegetarian, but I was eating, soy burgers and all this kind of stuff. And I would eat fish, right? But it was, one of those kind of lacto, what do you call it, pescatarian type approaches. And so, anyways, I started eating grass-fed meats. I started reducing the amount of grains, and the overall amount of carbs. This is like before anybody was talking about the paleo diet. We just called it the healing diet. In fact, another doctor that I was a part of an association with was Dr. Dan Pompa. I don't know if you're familiar with him,
Yeah.
but he was using this approach called the cellular healing diet. So I pretty much took my knowledge from reading The Maker's Diet, reading a lot of Dr. Mercola's work, Udo Erasmus, Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill, along with what Dr. Pompa was teaching. And it made a huge difference. And I was gaining weight, and I was feeling significantly better, but I still was struggling with a lot of fatigue and brain fog, and I still had very low blood pressure. So I was taking visceral physiology classes and labs and things like that. We'd take our blood pressure every day because we're medical students. And like my blood pressure was like 90/60, right? And most people, if your blood pressure is 90/60 and you're in your doctor's office, they're going to be like, that's a great blood pressure. Like you have such a low blood pressure. Problem is when your blood pressure is that low, you have trouble getting blood up into your brain. So you don't think sharply. My hands, my feet were always cold. You actually need a certain level of pressure. Like the pressure is good, gets blood flow into the deep extremities, into your brain so you could think sharp and quick. And so I was dealing with all of this. And then I just started noticing, and it was part of just becoming more fat adapted because I was eating a low carb diet. I noticed that, and I was taking 7 a.m. classes in graduate school. So, I would get up and sometimes I didn't have a whole lot of time to eat. I would study for a test or whatever it was. And so I would just drink a whole lot of water. In fact, I would carry around like a gallon water jug with me to classes. And I noticed if I just drank a lot of water in the mornings, I felt significantly better. And I had never heard the term time restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, or anything like that. In fact, I started gaining more weight back. In fact, I got to my peak level of fitness. I was extremely strong. And I would fast until roughly about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I would eat between like 3 and 7 or 8. And I actually didn't get hungry till about 3 o'clock. And all of a sudden I got ravenous. And I was telling my friends were like, what are you doing? Like, how are you? Like, they saw me gaining weight. I was getting significantly stronger. And I was like, I think it's the water. I was drinking a gallon of water a day. And I thought, oh, it's the water there. It's increasing my sarcomeres, creating, just better myofibril contractions. I was trying to come up with all these kind of physiological explanations. It wasn't until later that I realized, oh, it's actually the intermittent fasting
Mhm.
enhancing my mitochondrial function. So my mitochondria, my muscles, and the cells in my body were functioning significantly better. I was able to produce more energy. The hydration was a good thing, but certainly wasn't the main factor in why I was able to do that. But I got my brain back, got my body back, and that's I've been intermittent fasting ever since 2005. And it's made a huge difference on my life and my health. And then I've worked with many different clients over the years and seen tremendous results, with them using it.
Excellent. Okay, so I want to dig into some of the controversy around intermittent fasting. So
Mhm.
um, the way that I see it, and that I've looked at a lot of the literature on this. I don't want to say all, but probably close to all of the studies on this. And I've also seen it debated in different scientific circles. And what I see is sort of two camps. One is the fasting has all these amazing benefits camp, and the other camp, like in a lot of, for example, quote unquote, evidence-based fitness circles, they will say, you know, the studies that compare intermittent fasting approaches to, equivalent calorie diets where people eat 3 or 4 times a day, but it's the exact same amount of calories as the intermittent fasting group, had essentially the same weight loss, body composition changes, and therefore there's no real magic to intermittent fasting. It's just the benefits of low calorie eating. Um, what, in your opinion, are the most compelling benefits of intermittent fasting versus
Yeah.
eating low calories, equivalently low calories, but in a more typical eating pattern of a few meals per day?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. And a lot of people do practice intermittent fasting for fat loss and weight management. For me personally, I've never done that. In fact, I've never in my life ever wanted to lose weight. I've always wanted to actually put on weight. And I'm somebody who practices intermittent fasting, which if you had told me, if you had said this to me 20 years ago, 15, right before I started doing intermittent fasting, I would have said, that's crazy. I would never do that. And so the reality is that fasting offers so many more benefits than just fat burning, although fat burning is an important thing. One thing it does, it helps reduce your insulin load, right? And so if we're constantly eating, every time we eat, even if we're eating, a stick of butter, we're going to produce some level of insulin. Some foods are more insulogenic than others, meaning we produce more insulin when we eat them than other foods. And insulin is a superhero hormone. It takes sugar out of the bloodstream, puts it into the cells. If we have high blood sugar, we get advanced glycation end products. These things, are like shrapnel going through our bloodstream, destroy our kidneys, our liver, our nerves, right? All kinds of stuff like that. So insulin's an amazing hormone. We need a good amount of insulin. We need to be able to produce it, but we only want to produce it, we want to produce the right amount and not too often throughout the day, right? That's really the key. And so when we are constantly eating, like every few hours, we're constantly stoking insulin. And when we do that, we get a higher amount of insulin load throughout the day. There's only so much insulin we're going to be able to produce, in a certain period of time. Like if we eat a whole bunch of calories in 1 hour, we're only going to be able to produce a certain amount of insulin in that 1 hour. However, if we're eating, the same amount of calories that we would eat in that 1 hour, but in 3 meals, every 3 hours, we're actually going to produce roughly somewhere around 20% more insulin when we do that. And so our overall insulin load goes up. And the more that the more that we're stoking insulin, or we have insulin up, insulin's telling the body store fat, right? It stops the breakdown of fat, stops lipolysis. So that's one thing. Insulin can also trigger inflammatory gene pathways, right? So we also get an upregulation of inflammation when insulin goes over a certain threshold. So for one person, they may be very insulin sensitive, and it may be very hard for them to get over that certain threshold. But for another person eating the same foods, they're going to shoot up over that threshold a lot faster, and they're going to get more inflammation in their system. So fasting, by keeping insulin down, by lowering insulin, really reduces overall inflammation, turns on fat burning. And then when insulin's low, we also get this mechanism of autophagy. And autophagy is really where our body breaks down old damaged cellular organelles. So, for example, within the cell, one of the most important structures is the mitochondria. That's where we produce all the energy in the cell. And so these mitochondria are very susceptible to oxidative damage, just the process of metabolism. We could eat a great diet, take really good care of ourselves. They're still going to rust from the inside. So we need to repair them. And so when insulin is up, it turns off, or basically it tells our body we're not in a place, we're not in an environment to repair these mitochondria. When insulin comes down, now we can start to repair the mitochondria. So we go in, we start breaking down the mitochondria, take those raw materials, utilize them to form new, healthier, stronger, more stress resilient mitochondria. And so that's extremely important because that makes our body more resilient to stress, more efficient. Those mitochondria are better at burning fat. When the mitochondria oxidize and they rust and they become inefficient, they become really bad at burning fat. And they can even get to the point where they can only burn glucose, where basically our cell can only burn glucose because the mitochondria are so damaged. And now we get really bad fatty acid oxidation. So we become less, and I know your listeners know that when we burn fat for fuel, we produce a lot more energy. And fat is a cleaner fuel. We produce less oxidative stress and free radicals when we burn fat for fuel than when we burn sugar. So if we're stuck in sugar burning mode, then we're going to produce a lot more oxidative stress, a lot more free radicals. We're going to damage these mitochondria, all the different intracellular organelles. We're going to damage them a lot faster when we're stuck in chronic sugar burning mode as opposed to fat burning mode. And then on top of that, we also can produce ketones. And the reason why our body will produce ketones is because it's really hard to get fatty acids across the blood-brain barrier. So our brain needs a constant source of fuel. For the most part, we're burning glucose in our brain. But if we are at a period where we're not consuming food for a good period of time, glucose levels start to go down. And if we're not good at producing and utilizing ketones as an energy source, we develop hypoglycemic reactions. We've all been there. We're irritable, we're hangry, right? We're hungry and irritable. We have headaches, nausea, and this is all related to brain cells dying because they're not getting the fuel that they need. So ketones they're a byproduct of fat metabolism. The liver produces them. They get into the bloodstream and they can cross through through the blood-brain barrier into the brain. And the brain cells, once they're adapted to them, they uptake them and utilize them for energy very, very effectively. Right. And they really thrive on them. They're able to produce a lot of energy, very little oxidative stress. And they actually have been shown, elevated ketones in our bloodstream have been shown to actually reduce these inflammatory pathways that basically amplify inflammation. Right. So it's kind of like, I compare it like a siren, like an alarm in a city. So, you might have crime in one area, right? Like, let's say somebody goes and robs a bank and we have crime in that one specific location, and that's some level of like really localized oxidative stress and inflammation. However, what happens in our body is when there's, massive, let's say protests or something like that, right? They're not peaceful, right? All over the city, we turn on an entire alarm system because our body's like, okay, I don't want to die from some sort of systemic infection. This could be like a bacteria that's going to cause meningitis and kill me quickly. So I'm just going to amp up inflammation, bring out all these cytokines to help clean up the environment so this bacteria or whatever it is doesn't kill me quickly, and so we get this ramp up of inflammation. And one of the pathways is called the neuroinflammasome in the brain. And so ketones have been shown to shut that off, right? And this is a big issue. The inflammasome itself is a great thing. It saves us. If we get a massive infection, we know infections have killed more people throughout the history of mankind than anything else, from pneumonia, from meningitis. People, when they would be in battle or whatever it was, they would get flesh wounds. And then it was actually the bacteria that would get into their system and kill them quickly. So our body created this inflammatory process. That's a beautiful thing. We just have to be able to shut it off. And in our society, we keep doing things that are like, pouring gasoline on the fire and keeping that going. And fasting allows us to turn that off by getting the ketones up, getting insulin down, turning on self-repair mechanisms. And that's really why I like to do it. I feel amazing from a mental clarity perspective, from an energy perspective. I feel like I'm more resilient to stress practicing this on a regular basis. And then as a side benefit, for somebody that's looking to lose weight, it can definitely help benefit your weight loss journey.
It's interesting to me, being a traditional allopathic trained provider, that I used to think about fasting representing itself as starvation. And I'm happy to say that I have learned better since my original thought process around that. When I think about intermittent fasting, it's really eating less frequently. And in our harried modern day lifestyles, more often than not, people are eating between sugar sweetened beverages and food. They're eating anywhere from 6 to 10 to 15 times a day. And so intermittent fasting is providing a structure around which people are eating within a particular eating window. It could be 8 hours, could be 10 hours, could be 6 hours, could be 4. Although I will explain why I prefer that people have a wider feeding window as opposed to a very compressed one. And in terms of, the largest benefits, the ones that I think a lot of women in particular come to intermittent fasting out of an innate curiosity is they want to change body composition, they want to lose weight, but there's so much more to fasting than that. For me, I see so much improvement in inflammation. So a lot of chronic inflammatory conditions, reduction in oxidative stress, a reduction and improvement in baseline, body metrics. So blood pressure, cholesterol, insulin, glucose, improvement in brain health and cognition. And we know that for individuals, once they are transitioning to being able to use fuel more efficiently, they are effectively utilizing both carbohydrates and fats as a fuel source. They will have diffusion of ketones across the blood-brain barrier. So they'll say, I have so much mental clarity, I have so much energy. And a lot of what I think about is just the process of not eating so frequently. So this degree of digestive rest. Fast long enough, you'll get different benefits than when you fast for shorter periods of time. But we know things like autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process in the body that, based on whomever you're speaking to, whatever paper you're looking at, how that can be upregulated around 24 hours. But I don't ever think about it switching on and off entirely. So people are still getting benefits. But those are typically some of the ones that maybe some are better known, some are less known. I also think about improvement in neurocognitive disorders, lowering our risk for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, a reduction in specific types of cancer, especially those reproductive cancers. And as I always say, people come to it to change body composition and they stay for all the other benefits very humbly.
Mm-hmm. So how would you distinguish between time-restricted feeding versus intermittent fasting?
It's interesting in the metabolic health space, there are some people that don't make tremendous distinctions. And so even if you're looking at Sachin Panda's work, he's one of these amazing researchers that is very focused on chronobiology, or the body rhythms and how they respond to insulin sensitivity and eating versus non-eating. I think when I look at it is time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting, there's a lot of similarities and then perhaps some differences. However, for the purposes of this conversation, I would say that when I think about time-restricted feeding, it's really, having this kind of compressed time frame in which people are consuming all of their food, which seems very similar to intermittent fasting. I know when you look at some of the researchers, there are some that believe that it's very aligned, they're very synonymous, and others that feel very differently. To me, I don't see a lot of distinction between either of them. It's really defining a time period in which you choose not to eat and defining a time period in which you choose to eat, and then determining based on gender, life stage, et cetera, which one of those works best for you and your lifestyle and your hormones, to be completely frank.
So there's a weird gray area here, because we should obviously, as humans, we need to sleep for part of the day. As diurnal animals, we sleep during the nighttime period, and during that nighttime period, we should not be consuming any food. So there is a window of time built into our schedule where we shouldn't have food coming into the system. So, and then based on looking at, modern day hunter-gatherer tribes, traditional living people, we can, and combining that with modern research into the topic of time-restricted feeding and circadian rhythm and how nutrition interfaces with that, and all the animal experiments that have been done, we have good reason to believe that at least 12 hours, if not more, of our day should be fasting. But that should just be the normal state of eating. So we shouldn't call that, if someone has 12 hours of the 24-hour period of the day where they're not consuming food, or 14 hours, to me, it doesn't make sense to call that intermittent fasting. It makes sense to call that just a normal, healthy way of consuming food each day. So then the question becomes, well, how do we define intermittent fasting? Because some people do define intermittent fasting as consuming food within a 10 or 8 hour window of the day, whereas I would just say that is better termed time-restricted eating, and really that is just the normal thing that we should all be doing on a daily basis. So there has to be semantically some difference of definition between that versus what we're referring to as intermittent fasting. Do you agree with that, or how would you respond to my position on that?
No, I think that's certainly reasonable. I mean, when someone goes 12 hours without eating, I just call that digestive rest. And my standard, and I talk about this publicly a lot, is that should be the gold standard. Unfortunately, that's not the gold standard. I think your definition in that context is completely reasonable and feasible. And I think for a lot of us that are intermittent fasting, so fasting for longer periods of time, 16, 18 hours, we can acknowledge there's a pretty significant distinction. You're still getting benefits, even if you fast for 13 hours or 14 hours. And certainly someone that's new to fasting or just time-restricted eating in the context of this definition, there's still a lot of benefits that come through that or come with that. So from my perspective, when I'm thinking about longer episodes of fasting, that's when you start seeing some significant improvement with metrics. But in our current society, we are just encouraged to eat from the moment we get up to the moment we go to bed. And that's completely not aligned with our circadian biology. That's not aligned with our metabolic physiology. And I think for anyone that's listening, you may not per se be interested in intermittent fasting, but the time-restricted eating or feeding of a 12-hour time period during a day is certainly feasible. I have all teenagers, and even they go at least 12 hours a day without eating, and they eat a lot of food in their quote unquote time period in which they eat before they fall asleep. But for the rest of us that are adults and are fully grown and evolved, I think it should be the mainstay, and it should be what all clinicians are talking about with their patients, not just those of us in the kind of functional integrative medicine space.
So you mentioned something there in passing about morning versus evening time-restricted feeding. And I'm curious, so you mentioned what your impression is. I agree with your take on that. However, there is a practical aspect of this that a lot of people, I would say the majority of people, find difficulty with. So what I'm referring to for people listening to this is that there's a body of scientific literature that has shown that all things being equal, as far as the time window that one is consuming food and even the total daily calories consumed and the specific foods one eats during that window. Let's say a 1,200 calorie diet eaten during a 10-hour feeding window with these specific foods, but the difference being whether most of the daily calories are stacked towards the end of the day in the evening meal or the beginning of the day in the breakfast. Those studies generally, the body of literature generally favors increased benefits by stacking more calories earlier in the day. Now, the practical objection to this that most people struggle with is that most people don't have time to sit around and eat a big breakfast. And most people find, just culturally, we live in a society where it's sort of go, go, go first thing in the morning. And then in the evening, I get to sit and rest and have a big dinner. So what are your recommendations to people as far as navigating those kinds of practical issues that I'm sure you've encountered with many people many times?
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge that for those of us that are entrepreneurs, we are certainly very privileged that we probably have the flexibility to be able to eat when we want to. When I was still seeing patients clinically in the hospital and also in clinic, I was lucky if I got to eat lunch. So let's talk about the fact that a lot of people don't have the opportunity to eat because they're caring for other individuals, or their schedules just certainly don't allow for that. So I abide by the concept of good, better, best. So best is what we talked about. Eat early in the day. First meal of the day should really be your largest meal, really shutting things down by 5 or 6 o'clock at night. That's not realistic for everyone. So I think a lot of what I try to focus on is making sure that people are making good choices when they do break their fast, being prepared, doing meal prep, which I know is not a sexy topic. I have teenagers. If we didn't meal prep, we would have no food because they eat everything. And I'm not kidding. I mean, pounds and pounds of meat. So I think it's working with what is feasible. For some people, it may be, Cynthia, I have to be in my car. I can't eat in the car. What are my options? So finding like a clean, properly sourced protein powder so they have something, asking them to set aside some time. And if you can't do anything else, eat some protein, or finding alternative options for them and making sure that they're prepared for success. So I'll give you an example. I was in Denver at a low carb event this past weekend, and kind of explaining to followers on social media, this is what I do. These are my standard. I go to a restaurant. This is what I ask for. I can generally get it just about anywhere. And a lot of my colleagues were doing the same. Yeah, you can go to McDonald's and you can get 2 or 3 burger patties just all by themselves, wrapped up. I mean, if you just need to do nothing else. So it's all about reality, but also helping people prepare for when they're traveling, if they're in their car, which I hate having to eat in the car. I'll be completely transparent, but that's reality. A lot of people who, by the time they get home from work, they're exhausted. Their kids are screaming. They have to, feed their kids. They've got to bathe their kids. They have to put their kids to bed. So it could be 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night before they really have that wind down time. So really helping people understand there are going to be those good, better, best food choices. So protein first, always trying to aim for that protein, lessening your likelihood that you come home in a cyclone and you eat everything in your pantry because you're so ravished and so hungry. So I think it really comes down to some degree of being deliberate. I definitely, when I was rounding in the hospital, I would carry, and I'm not suggesting everyone do this, but again, being a little bit of a realist, clean protein source or beef jerky, something so that when you have the ability to sit down for 5 minutes, you have something healthy to eat, you will make better food choices. I think it's also important just to be honest and say every once in a while, you are more than likely going to not make a stellar decision. And you might end up eating something that doesn't agree with you, impacts your sleep quality, spikes your blood sugar. You have to let it go and take it as a learning opportunity. And so when I'm working with women in particular who are struggling with the evening, they don't get their meal done before 7, 8 o'clock at night, helping them make the best choice under those circumstances, have the protein, have the veggies, try to get in bed, understand tomorrow's a new day, try to stay really well hydrated during the day, because dehydration can mimic a lot of symptoms that people are trying to avoid, the headaches, the brain fog, etc. But I think it comes down to having a plan, meal prepping as much as you can, having a plan if you're, traveling and you don't have consistent control over every parameter under which you can abide by in a restaurant. I'm dedicated gluten-free and dairy-free. But when I go to a restaurant, I probably am getting some seed oil exposure, but I don't allow myself to not enjoy the meal, understanding that I may get some transient exposure to things I don't normally eat, because then it would just be obsessive. So the point of what I'm sharing is finding a situation and a solution that works well for each individual. And if it's the weekends when you have more flexibility, that's really the time to lean into those good habits. We know that even people that fast 2 days a week are going to derive benefit. So maybe you have a longer fast on a work day, and on the weekend, maybe you have a wider window and you really are diligent about hitting your protein metrics and those healthy fats and the right types of carbohydrates. So I think the point of what I'm trying to say to you and your listeners is that, give yourself some grace, plan ahead. When you have opportunities to eat early in the day, try to lean into it, but don't become obsessive about it. But I find for a lot of people, just eating those protein, trying to hit those protein macros, at least 30, 40, 50 grams of protein allows them to make better decisions when they are able to eat.
Mm-hmm.